Jean-Paul Sartre was born into a world that would force him to confront one of the most unsettling truths about human existence: the realization that life does not come with a predetermined meaning, and that every individual must create meaning for themselves through their choices. He was born on June 21st, 1905, in Paris, France, into a middle-class family shaped by education and discipline. His father, Jean-Baptiste Sartre, was an officer in the French Navy, a man trained in structure, hierarchy, and duty. His mother, Marie Schweitzer, came from an educated and culturally refined family. However, Sartre's life was shaped very early by loss. When he was only 15 months old, his father died from a sudden illness. This absence would quietly shape his psychological development. He would grow up without a father, without a dominant male authority figure imposing discipline or expectation. Instead, he was raised primarily by his mother and his maternal grandfather, Charles Schweitzer, a man who would have a profound influence on his intellectual formation. His grandfather was a German language teacher, deeply committed to literature, education, and intellectual discipline. Charles Schweitzer believed in the power of the mind above all else. He filled the home with books and encouraged young Sartre to read constantly. From a very early age, Sartre was surrounded by literature, philosophy, and language. He did not grow up in physical hardship, but he grew up in an environment where intellectual achievement was valued above everything else. This environment created in Sartre a deep identification with his mind. He began to see himself not as a physical being defined by strength or appearance, but as a consciousness defined by thought. This distinction would later become central to his philosophy. As a child, Sartre was physically small and had a noticeable condition in his right eye, which gave him a slightly asymmetrical appearance. This physical difference made him feel separate from others. He became deeply aware of how others perceived him. He realized that identity was not only something internal, but something shaped by the gaze of others. This awareness would later become one of the most important elements of his philosophical work. He would argue that human beings are constantly aware of being seen, judged, and defined by others, and that this awareness creates psychological tension. Sartre spent much of his childhood immersed in imagination and literature. He read extensively and began writing at a young age. Writing allowed him to create worlds and identities that were not limited by his physical circumstances. He discovered that through writing, he could assert control over meaning. He could shape reality rather than simply accept it. This realization planted the early seeds of his existential thinking, the idea that human beings are not defined by fixed essence, but by the choices they make. As he grew older, Sartre attended some of the most prestigious schools in France. He eventually entered the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, one of the most elite intellectual institutions in the country. This school trained the future intellectual leaders of France, producing philosophers, writers, and political thinkers. It was here that Sartre encountered the major philosophical traditions that had shaped Western thought. He studied the works of René Descartes, who emphasized the importance of consciousness. He studied Immanuel Kant, who explored the limits of human knowledge and the structure of moral responsibility. He studied George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who described the dynamic relationship between self and society. These thinkers shaped Sartre's intellectual foundation, but he did not simply accept their conclusions. He questioned them, challenged them, and sought to go further. During his studies, Sartre formed one of the most important relationships of his life. He met Simone de Beauvoir, a fellow philosophy student who would become his intellectual partner and lifelong companion. Their relationship was unlike traditional romantic relationships of their time. They did not marry, and they did not restrict each other's freedom. Instead, they built their connection on intellectual equality and mutual respect. They shared ideas, challenged each other's thinking, and influenced each other's work. Simone de Beauvoir would later become one of the most influential philosophers and writers in her own right. Together, they formed a partnership based on the shared belief that human beings must create their own identity rather than accept predefined roles. After completing his education, Sartre began working as a teacher. He taught philosophy in secondary schools, introducing students to complex ideas about existence, freedom, and responsibility. Teaching allowed him to refine his own thinking. Explaining philosophical ideas forced him to clarify his understanding. During this time, he also began writing seriously. He was not satisfied with simply studying philosophy. He wanted to contribute something new. He wanted to understand the nature of human existence at its deepest level. A crucial turning point in his intellectual development came when he encountered the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. Husserl argued that philosophy should focus on direct human experience rather than abstract theories detached from reality. He emphasized that consciousness is always directed toward something. Consciousness is never empty. It is always aware of objects, thoughts, or experiences. Sartre was deeply influenced by this idea. He realized that consciousness was not a static thing, but an active process. It was constantly interpreting, choosing, and creating meaning. Sartre took this insight further. He began to see that consciousness has no fixed essence. Unlike physical objects, which have defined characteristics, consciousness is defined by its freedom. A chair has a fixed structure. It cannot choose to become something else. But a human being can choose their actions, their beliefs, and their identity. This freedom is both powerful and terrifying. It means that human beings cannot escape responsibility for their lives. They cannot blame their nature, their past, or their circumstances entirely. They must accept that their choices shape who they become. This realization formed the foundation of Sartre philosophy, which would later be known as existentialism. Existentialism begins with a radical claim. Existence comes before essence. This means that human beings are not born with predetermined purpose or identity. They exist first, and then, through their choices, they create their essence. A person is not born courageous or cowardly. They become courageous or cowardly through their actions. Identity is not fixed. It is constructed through lived experience. This idea was deeply unsettling because it removed the comfort of predetermined meaning. Many people believe that their role in life is defined by tradition, religion, or social expectation. Sartre argued that these structures do not determine identity. Individuals always retain the freedom to choose their response. Even refusing to choose is itself a choice. By the 1930s, Sartre had begun to emerge as a unique philosophical voice. He was not merely repeating the ideas of earlier thinkers. He was building something new. He was describing human existence not as fixed and stable, but as open, uncertain, and defined by choice. He believed that human beings are condemned to be free, not because freedom is a punishment, but because it is unavoidable. Every moment of life presents choices, and every choice shapes who a person becomes. As Europe moved closer to the Second World War, Sartre philosophical ideas were no longer developing in quiet academic spaces, but within a world that was collapsing into violence, authoritarianism, and moral crisis. The rise of fascism in Germany, the spread of nationalist extremism, and the instability of European democracies forced intellectuals to confront urgent political realities. Sartre, who had spent years thinking about freedom as an abstract philosophical principle, was now living in a time when freedom itself was under direct threat. In 1939, when war officially began, he was drafted into the French army as a meteorologist. His role was not combat-based, but he was still part of a military structure defined by hierarchy and obedience. This experience placed him inside a system where individual choice was limited by command, and it deepened his awareness of how institutions shape human behavior. In 1940, during the German invasion of France, Sartre was captured by German forces and taken as a prisoner of war. He spent approximately 9 months in a prisoner camp. This period was crucial for his intellectual development. In captivity, stripped of ordinary freedoms, Sartre confronted directly what it meant to be physically constrained yet internally conscious. Even within the limits of imprisonment, he observed that prisoners still made choices. They chose how to interpret their situation. They chose whether to despair or to endure. They chose whether to cooperate or resist. This reinforced his growing conviction that freedom is not simply the ability to move physically without restriction. Freedom exists in the capacity of consciousness to choose its attitude and response, even under extreme constraint. While in captivity, Sartre continued to read and write. He organized small discussions among fellow prisoners, exploring philosophical questions even within the confines of the camp. This behavior demonstrated something central to his character. He did not separate philosophy from life. For him, thinking was not an academic exercise detached from reality. It was a tool for survival and understanding. When he was eventually released in 1941 and returned to occupied France, he came back to a country under Nazi control. Paris was no longer free. Surveillance, censorship, and fear shaped daily life. During the German occupation, Sartre began writing some of his most important works. In 1943, he published Being and Nothingness, a massive philosophical text that systematically presented his existentialist philosophy. This work was dense and complex, but at its core was a powerful analysis of consciousness, freedom, and self-deception. Sartre distinguished between two fundamental modes of existence. The first he called being in itself, which describes objects. Objects simply are what they are. A rock is a rock. It does not question its existence. It does not imagine alternatives. It does not feel anxiety about its future. The second he called being for itself, which describes human consciousness. Human beings are aware of themselves. They can reflect on their past and imagine their future. They're never simply fixed. They're always in the process of becoming. This distinction led Sartre to one of his most important ideas, the concept of nothingness. Human consciousness introduces nothingness into the world because it can imagine what is not yet real. A person can imagine becoming something different from what they are now. This gap between present reality and imagined possibility creates freedom, but it also creates anxiety. Anxiety arises when a person realizes that there is no fixed structure guaranteeing who they will become. There is no predefined script. Every choice opens one path and closes others. The weight of this responsibility can feel overwhelming. Sartre argued that many people attempt to escape this anxiety through what he called bad faith. Bad faith is a form of self-deception in which individuals deny their own freedom by pretending that they're defined entirely by their roles or circumstances. For example, a person might say they have no choice because society expects something from them. They might claim their identity is fixed by their profession, their family background, or their social position. Sartre rejected this view. While he acknowledged that circumstances influence individuals, he insisted that people always retain the freedom to choose their response. To deny this freedom is to live in bad faith. He illustrated this concept with everyday examples. He described a waiter who performs his job with exaggerated precision, acting as if he is nothing more than a waiter. By fully identifying with the role, the waiter avoids confronting the broader truth that he is a free individual who could choose a different path. Sartre did not criticize the job itself. He criticized the idea of reducing identity to a fixed role. Human beings are always more than their current function. They are defined by their capacity to transcend their present situation through choice. During this period, Sartre also wrote plays and novels that explored these philosophical themes in narrative form. His novel Nausea, published earlier in 1938, depicted a man overwhelmed by the realization that objects and events exist without inherent meaning. The protagonist experiences a deep sense of discomfort when he recognizes that existence simply is, without explanation or justification. This feeling of nausea symbolizes the shock of confronting a world without predetermined purpose. Through fiction, Sartre allowed readers to emotionally experience existential ideas rather than simply analyze them intellectually. His plays, such as No Exit, further explore the tension between self and others. In No Exit, three characters are trapped together in a room, unable to escape each other's gaze. The famous line from the play, often summarized as hell, is other people, reflects Sartre insight into how the presence of others shapes self-identity. When we become aware that others are observing us, we see ourselves through their perspective. Their judgment can feel like a limitation on our freedom. Yet Sartre did not mean that other people are literally torture. He meant that human relationships inevitably involve tension because we are both subjects who observe and objects who are observed. At the same time, Sartre's involvement in political resistance was complex. Although he was not a central leader of the French resistance, he participated in intellectual resistance through underground publications and discussions. He believed that philosophy could not remain neutral in times of oppression. Freedom was not merely an abstract principle. It had political consequences. If individuals are free and responsible for their choices, then they are also responsible for how they respond to injustice. By the end of the war in 1945, Sartre had become one of the most prominent intellectual figures in France. His lectures attracted large audiences. Existentialism became a cultural movement, influencing literature, theater, art, and politics. Cafes in Paris became spaces where young people discussed freedom, responsibility, and authenticity. Sartre, often sitting with Simone de Beauvoir in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, became a visible symbol of this movement. He was no longer just a philosopher writing dense books. He was a public intellectual whose ideas shaped an entire generation. Yet even as his fame grew, the core of his philosophy remained unchanged. Human beings are free. They cannot escape responsibility for their choices. They create themselves through action. There is no external authority that can remove this burden. Freedom is not something granted. It is something that cannot be avoided. And with it comes the full weight of responsibility for becoming who one chooses to be. After the Second World War ended, Jean-Paul Sartre entered the most influential and controversial phase of his life, a period in which he was no longer simply a philosopher developing theories about freedom and responsibility, but a global intellectual figure whose words carried political weight across continents. The devastation of the war had left Europe morally shaken. Millions were dead, cities were destroyed, and the revelations of concentration camps forced humanity to confront the consequences of blind obedience and ideological extremism. In this fragile environment, Sartre's message about individual responsibility resonated deeply. He argued that the horrors of the war were not caused by abstract forces alone, but by countless individual choices. Even within oppressive systems, individuals had made decisions. Some complied, some resisted, some remained silent. For Sartre, these choices mattered. They defined who people became. In 1945, Sartre delivered a lecture titled Existentialism Is, Humanism, which became one of the most widely read introductions to his philosophy. Many critics had accused existentialism of promoting despair, moral chaos, and selfish individualism. Sartre responded by clarifying that his philosophy did not deny morality. Instead, it placed morality directly in human hands. If there is no predetermined human nature and no divine blueprint assigning purpose, then each individual, through their choices, becomes responsible not only for themselves, but also for the image of humanity they create. When a person chooses an action, they are implicitly declaring that this action represents a way a human being can live. In this sense, every choice carries universal weight. Freedom is not isolation. It is responsibility toward all humanity. This idea intensified the emotional seriousness of his philosophy. It was not enough to say that people are free. They are free in a world shared with others. Every decision contributes to shaping that shared world. Sartre rejected the idea that one could escape responsibility by claiming to follow orders or social expectations. To obey blindly is still to choose obedience. To remain silent in the face of injustice is still to choose silence. Even refusing to act is an action. There is no escape from responsibility. As his fame grew, Sartre increasingly involved himself in political debates. He aligned himself with leftist movements and showed sympathy toward Marxism, believing that economic structures played a significant role in shaping human possibilities. However, his relationship with Marxism was complicated. He admired its analysis of class struggle and material conditions, but he refused to accept any system that reduced individuals to mere products of economic forces. For Sartre, human freedom could not be erased even within powerful systems. This tension between existential freedom and social structure became a central challenge in his later work. In 1960, he published Critique of Dialectical Reason, an ambitious attempt to reconcile existentialism with Marxist theory. In this work, he examined how groups form, how collective movements emerge, and how individuals function within larger historical forces. He analyzed how people sometimes surrender their individuality to become part of what he called a series, such as individuals waiting in line, connected but isolated, lacking unified purpose. Yet under certain conditions, such as revolution or crisis, individuals can transform into a group in fusion, acting collectively with shared intention. Sartre was attempting to understand how freedom operates not only at the personal level, but also within social movements. During the 1950s and 1960s, Sartre became an outspoken critic of colonialism. He condemned French actions in Algeria and supported anti-colonial movements. His political activism was not without controversy. Some accused him of supporting violent resistance. Others criticized his sympathetic stance towards certain communist regimes. Sartre often walked a difficult line between defending revolutionary movements and criticizing authoritarianism. He believed that oppression must be resisted, but he also struggled with the moral complexities of political violence. His critics argued that his political positions sometimes contradicted his emphasis on individual freedom. Sartre responded by insisting that freedom cannot flourish under colonial domination or systemic injustice. For him, political engagement was an extension of existential responsibility. One of the most symbolic moments of his life occurred in 1964 when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. By this time, he was internationally recognized as one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. However, Sartre refused the prize. His refusal was consistent with his lifelong resistance to institutional authority and labels. He argued that a writer should not allow himself to be transformed into an institution. Accepting the prize, he believed, would align him with structures of cultural authority that might limit his independence. His decision shocked many, but it reinforced his image as a thinker committed to autonomy above prestige. Throughout this period, his relationship with Simone de Beauvoir remained central to his life. Their intellectual partnership endured decades of change, fame, criticism, and political turmoil. They wrote extensively, debated constantly, and influenced each other philosophical development. While Sartre focused heavily on freedom and consciousness, Beauvoir expanded existentialism into feminist analysis, examining how women had historically been treated as the other in male-dominated societies. Their collaboration demonstrated how existential ideas could be applied to social and gender issues, expanding the scope of the philosophy beyond individual psychology. Sartre's later years were marked by declining physical health, particularly his eyesight, which deteriorated significantly. Yet even as his body weakened, he continued to write, speak, and engage with political movements. Students and activists sought his support during the protests of May 1968 in France, when universities and workers challenged government authority. Sartre stood with the protesters, believing that young people questioning established systems were exercising their existential freedom. He saw in their actions the same fundamental principle he had defended for decades, the refusal to accept imposed identity. Despite criticism, controversy, and the complexity of his political involvement, the core of Sartre philosophy remained consistent. Human beings are not objects defined by fixed essence. They are conscious agents who define themselves through action. There is no external guarantee of meaning. Meaning is created. There is no escape from freedom. Even in constraint, there is choice. His life demonstrated the tension between theory and reality. He attempted not only to describe freedom, but to live it, to act publicly in accordance with his beliefs. Whether one agrees with his political judgments or not, it is clear that he did not retreat into comfortable neutrality. He accepted that if individuals are responsible for their choices, then intellectuals are responsible for their public positions. Sartre showed that philosophy is not merely reflection. It is commitment. It is the decision to live according to the truth one believes. And in a world without predetermined meaning, that decision becomes the foundation of identity itself. As Jean-Paul Sartre moved into the final years of his life, the intensity that had defined his intellectual and political journey did not disappear, but took on a quieter, more reflective tone. Decades of writing, lecturing, debating, protesting, and confronting the moral crises of the 20th century had left their mark on him physically and intellectually. His eyesight deteriorated severely, eventually leaving him nearly blind. For a man whose life had revolved around reading and writing, this loss could have been devastating. Yet even in this limitation, Sartre continued to work, dictating texts, engaging in interviews, and participating in political discussions. The physical weakening of his body did not alter his fundamental conviction that human beings remain responsible for their stance toward their circumstances. If anything, his own aging became another lived example of existential reality. He could not choose the decline of his body, but he could choose how to respond to it. In his later interviews and conversations, Sartre reflected more openly on the complexity of freedom. Earlier in his career, his language about freedom had often sounded absolute and uncompromising. Human beings are condemned to be free. They cannot escape responsibility. But as he aged, his analysis became more nuanced. He acknowledged more clearly the weight of social structures, economic pressures, and historical forces. Yet he never abandoned the core principle that individuals interpret and respond to these forces. Circumstances influence, but they do not fully determine. Between what happens to a person and how they respond lies consciousness. And within consciousness lies choice. Sartre's final years were also marked by continued engagement with global struggles. He spoke out against injustice, supported movements he believed aimed at liberation, and maintained his belief that intellectuals must not detach themselves from political reality. For him, neutrality in the face of oppression was itself a choice, and therefore a form of responsibility. This insistence sometimes drew criticism. Some argued that his political positions were inconsistent or overly sympathetic to certain revolutionary movements. Others believed he underestimated the dangers of ideological extremism. Sartre accepted criticism as part of public engagement. To speak publicly is to risk being wrong, but to remain silent out of fear of error would, in his view, be another form of bad faith. One of the most enduring aspects of Sartre's legacy is not merely the content of his philosophy, but the psychological experience he described so precisely. He gave language to feelings many people experience but struggle to articulate. The anxiety of standing before a major life decision and realizing that no external authority can guarantee the correct choice. The discomfort of recognizing that identity is not fixed, that it must be continuously created. The tension of being aware that others see and judge us, shaping how we see ourselves. The temptation to hide behind roles, professions, or social expectations to avoid confronting freedom. These are not abstract academic problems. They're daily human experiences. Sartre's philosophy resonated because it described modern life with clarity. He insisted that human existence has no predetermined script. There is no universal formula dictating what a person must become. This absence of fixed essence can feel frightening. It removes comfort. It removes certainty. But Sartre saw within this absence the possibility of authenticity. If identity is not given, then it can be consciously shaped. A person can decide what values to commit to. They can decide what kind of life to build. They can acknowledge their fear and act anyway. Authenticity for Sartre did not mean discovering a hidden true self buried inside. It meant honestly recognizing one freedom and taking responsibility for choices without self-deception. His relationship with Simone de Beauvoir remained central until the end of his life. They continued their intellectual exchange, reflecting on politics, literature, and philosophy. When Sartre's health declined significantly in the late 1970s, Beauvoir remained close. On April 15, 1980, Jean-Paul Sartre died in Paris at the age of 74. His funeral drew tens of thousands of people. Students, workers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens filled the streets. The scale of the public response demonstrated the magnitude of his influence. He was not simply a writer of difficult philosophical texts. He had become a symbol of intellectual engagement and existential courage. Yet perhaps the most powerful aspect of his legacy is not the public recognition, but the private confrontation his ideas continue to provoke. Sartre forces individuals to ask themselves difficult questions. If there is no predetermined meaning, what will you choose to stand for? If you cannot escape freedom, how will you use it? If your identity is shaped by your actions, what are your actions creating? These questions do not disappear with time. They remain relevant in every generation. Sartre did not offer comfort in the form of easy answers. He did not promise that freedom leads automatically to happiness. He acknowledged that freedom produces anxiety, responsibility, and sometimes isolation. But he believed that facing this reality honestly is more dignified than hiding behind illusions. To live in bad faith, pretending to be less free than one truly is, may feel safer in the short term, yet it leads to a life shaped by avoidance. To live authentically requires courage, because it requires accepting that one cannot shift blame for one existence on a destiny, society, or nature entirely. In the end, Sartre's message can be understood in a simple but demanding way. A human being first exists. They find themselves in a world not of their choosing. Within that world, they encounter limits, pressures, and influences. But within those conditions, they still choose. Through those choices, they define themselves. Identity is not discovered. It is constructed. Meaning is not found. It is created. He spent his life reminding humanity of something both empowering and unsettling. There is no script waiting to be followed. There is no fixed role waiting to be accepted. There is only the ongoing act of choosing. And in that act, quietly and continuously, a person becomes who they are.